We usually, this is more of an interactive study. It's not a preaching, it's not a lecture. And so we want to hear from you, but we don't have Judy or Joe here. So I expect you to, kind of fill in just a little bit because they both contribute often. We started a couple of weeks ago something a little bit different, what we would call a biographical study. That's not something we do very often. There's not too many of them. That we've done as I look back. Occasionally you'll grab somebody like David and you'll trace through his life and you'll say, what can we learn from his life? Other times you'll do smaller ones. One I always recommend is do a biographical study on Barnabas. He's just a nice, self-contained one. He's a neat disciple to learn and hear about throughout the book of Acts and even in some of Paul's letters. So I wanted to do one. I've never done a biographical study on the 12 disciples. Now, obviously, they have very different ranges of how much we know about them, but I wanted to go through each of these 12 disciples, talk about what is a disciple, first of all, and then kind of do that biographical study with each. Biographical studies, you have to dig a little harder. You got to look for some principles, try to pull some things out and say, really, what does it apply to our lives? So here are the questions we're asking. Who were these men? Who were these 12 disciples? What did they do? We can see that in the scriptures. We're going to look at a couple of them tonight, different references. And then the most important question, though, as we leave here, is there anything we learned from how they interacted with Jesus, how they spoke to him, how they demonstrated faith? What can we learn from them for our lives today? How does this affect me on Thursday? What we're hearing from these disciples. So that's our goal tonight. And so as we talk through these, we're getting a little bit more meat on the bone. We started with some disciples that we didn't know that much about. We began even by defining what a disciple is. We saw in Greek, it's mathetes would be the word for disciple, and it just simply means learners, pupils, followers. Jesus had tons of disciples. Probably numbered in the thousands by the time he left Earth, and we even see turning in the pages of Acts. But I think that we would refer to these guys more as apostolos in the Greek, and that would be what we translate as apostles. And Jesus even calls them that in a couple of places. Apostles might be a better term. So we looked at a couple of lists in answering the questions, who are these guys? We see there's no two lists that are exactly the same order, or so we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke all provide us with a list of the 12 apostles. Acts also provides us with one of the 11, because obviously Judas Iscariot was gone by that time. And then John mentions a couple of disciples in there. We're going through these kind of in a reverse order with the exception of Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot. I'm leaving for the end because every single person puts Judas last, so I feel like I should honor that. But we started with three relatively unknown ones. Bartholomew, who we believe in John is called Nathaniel. James, son of Alphaeus. And then we talked about Thaddeus, who we believe in Luke, Acts, and even in John is called James or Judas, not Iscariot. So Judas, son of James. And then last week we dug in just a little bit more, and these are that was my favorite part because these are guys I didn't know much about. We talked about Philip, we talked about Thomas, and we talked about Matthew. And we found out the takeaway from those three that we knew a little bit more about than those first three was that they were three very different disciples. Three very different men that Jesus had chosen for the same role of apostle. You had Matthew, who we speculated was probably wealthy, given his role as a tax collector, and was probably hated speculated because of his role as a tax collector. They liked to skim some off the top, to add a little bit more. And then you've got Thomas. We don't know much about Thomas's past, but we do know that when he was with Jesus, he's a bit cynical. He got the kind of a bad rap as a doubting Thomas. He just wasn't there. It's not his fault. He wasn't in the room when Jesus first showed up. And then we heard about Philip. Philip was very down to earth. Was able to bring others and to introduce Christ, was a bringer, was often just bringing people to Christ. Had his issues as well, but They were three very different guys, and what we saw from that is Jesus can use all of us, amen? That's kind of the main lesson that we took from that, and I think it's going to continue to be the main lesson as we study 12 ordinary men. Jesus did not pick scholars. He did not pick religious leaders by any means. He picked very regular guys. So tonight we're going to look at two that we add a little bit more meat to. We've got enough time to get through both of them. We're going to look through Andrew and James. So they're both in that top list of four there, so a little bit more to look at for them. Any comments from the first 6 disciples that we've looked at? Or any thoughts as you've dwelled on it? Dwelt on it? That's the right word. I think it's dwelt. All right, let's jump into Andrew then. Andrew, the first thing we hear about Andrew is we do get to hear about his calling. We don't get to hear about every disciple's calling, but Andrew is one that we can read about that in both Matthew and Mark and then in John as well. Let's look at Matthew and Mark's accounts first. All these will be on your screen since I'm hopping around so much. Matthew chapter 4, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he, being Jesus, saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Mark gives a very similar account in Mark chapter 1, passing along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. What word sticks out to you there in both of those? The word immediately. It's an incredible word, and we'll even see that in James' calling as well, and it's the word that definitely sticks out. Andrew, interestingly enough, we'll break down a little more of this here in a second. I want to go into John's account because it's a little bit different. Andrew is commonly called the protokletos in Greek, and that would be the first called. And it's because of John's account that's slightly different than Matthew and Mark. Let's read it in John chapter 1. The next day again, John, being John the Baptist in this case, was standing with 2 of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." Those 2 disciples heard him say this, and so they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means the Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter, which we know in Greek means what? The rock. So a little bit different here, and then we can break down some of the content. Most scholars, I think, would agree that we've got 2 different accounts here because they're 2 different times. In John, we've got Andrew's first introduction to this teacher, Jesus. And in Matthew and Mark, you've got their calling to become full-time disciples and to leave what they were doing. So here in John, you've got the very first interaction that Andrew had with Jesus, and I think it's a beautiful one, right? He's following John the Baptist. John's message was repent, and then John, who has been probably teaching him for years, as Andrew was one of his disciples, says, "Behold the Son of God." And immediately Andrew went after him. Jesus says, "Why are you following me?" And they said, "Well, we just want to know where you're staying." They stay with him, and Andrew is convinced in that one day that this is the Christos, the Messiah, the anointed one. And so in the Matthew and Mark account then, by that time, Jesus was somebody they already knew. It was somebody that they had met before. They had heard some of his teaching. But does that make immediately any less surprising? Let's break that down a little. they probably then didn't drop everything and follow a total stranger. They followed Jesus because they had heard him. They believed that he was the Messiah. Does that change the story for you at all, or do you not believe that that's the case? Do you like thinking that just this guy walks up and says, hey, follow me, and they leave? For some reason, I like this idea better, that John gives us the initial meeting, and that they're first figuring out who Jesus is, and then Matthew and Mark give us this account of them dropping everything and walking out. Thoughts? It does make more sense, yeah. Because it always bothered me when we present it as some dude walks up and says, follow me, and they left. And it's like, I'm not sure that's boldness. I'm sure that means they don't like fishing. They just want an excuse to be done with this. Yeah, Val. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But they hadn't even had a chance to hear him if he just immediately calls. And I think this is more convincing that there was something about this guy. And I'm willing to walk away from everything I know to follow him. Yep, that's what it seems like. Yeah, Richard. So usually scholars would say Mark was written first under the account of Peter. John Mark sat with Peter and kind of got his recollections, and then Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark while they were writing and they were reflecting. So Matthew based on his own reflections, Luke based on basically being a journalist. Luke is just doing an investigation, and then John wrote a whole nother time. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are commonly called the synoptics. When you hear me say that, those are because they tell the same general story, whereas John tells his own account, and it's sometimes a little bit unique. Let's go back to the Matthew and Mark account. Anything else that you would see from that? There's another phrase that we often use here. Jesus is using a metaphor. He says, okay, they were fishermen, but I will make you now fishers of men. Nice play on words in the English, too, but what does he mean by that? I mean, I know we've reviewed this phrase, but let's put ourselves back in that context. This is a teacher they've probably heard, and he comes by and he says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. What is he doing there? What is he saying? Capture men's attention. Okay, I like that, yeah. That's true. Sometimes we think about this as the way we fish. We bait and we try to hook people and reel them in. In general, they're going to go out. And if you remember that's why I believe apostles is a better phrase, because apostolos meant messengers, representatives of. They're going to go out and they're going to cast a net. And those that they pull in will be ones that are part of the kingdom. So yeah, it really is a beautiful metaphor. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely, yep. Yeah, so these guys are all fishermen, Jewish, and they immediately left their nets and followed him. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. What a calling. And again, I think it makes more sense that they already knew Jesus, they had already heard some teaching, but still, that word immediately, don't let that dilute that word. That's still incredible, that they dropped their nets and they said, I'm changing my vocation. I am changing my life's plan. And instead of doing what I had in mind, I'm going to follow who I believe to be the Messiah. So Andrew is always listed among those first four disciples. We looked at the three groups of four that the disciples are always in every single list, the groups are the same, and there's the same first person. Peter leads the first group, Philip leads the second group, and James, son of Alphaeus, always leads the third group. Well, that top group always gets a little bit more attention, and Andrew's included in that. Occasionally, then, he got to witness some special miracles as a result. Shortly after we read of his calling in Mark chapter 1, we read of one of those occasions where Andrew got to be in on something that not all the rest of the disciples got to see. It might be because they hadn't been called yet. It might just be because he was considered a little more special. Immediately, he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew. So if you remember, they were brothers, and James and John was with them. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and he took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her. And she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So we've got a group of 4 here. We've got 2 sets of brothers, James and John. We'll talk about James in a minute. And then we've got Simon, Peter, and Andrew. At this point, quite possibly they were the only 4 that had been called and were hanging out with Jesus. Maybe Jesus hadn't even made that official call yet, because we don't really see it happen in John. Regardless, there were just 4 of them. They take him to Simon Peter's house, and he heals his mother-in-law. I think sometimes we read through the Gospels and we just shrug off some of this stuff. But imagine they've just kind of getting to know who Jesus is. And Peter says, well, my mother-in-law's sick. I can't come out tonight or whatever. I don't know. I've got to do this. I don't know what it was. And Jesus said, I can take care of that. Come, they invite him over. How do you think Andrew felt at this point? He already believed that Jesus was the Messiah, right? That's how he introduced him to Peter. He said, hey, come and meet the guy. We found the Messiah, the Christ. How do you think he felt after watching this? Yeah, and he's going to see even greater stuff, but at this point, he knew Simon Peter's mother-in-law. They all lived in the same house, and he knew she'd been sick probably for a while. This fever, they didn't have doctors. They're just trying to figure out what's going on, and he had to be in awe. Had to be. Absolutely wondrous. Let's move on to another miracle. I almost said bigger. Is there such a thing? There's incredible miracles throughout. In one of Philip's instances last week, we saw a well-known miracle, and let's revisit it and then go on in the story. And we kind of left it at Philip's part, but I want to go on because Andrew has a part in this. After this, Jesus went away to the other side. This is John chapter 6. And went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand, and lifting up his eyes, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to even get a little. So that was Philip's part. And then verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. And now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. And so an incredible miracle, an amazing one. Let's talk about Andrew's part. We know this miracle. We've heard it dozens of times. What was Andrew's part of the story? Bringing a little boy. So let's look at Philip again. What did Philip say? He said 200 denarii. That's a lot of money. That's a denarius would have been a day laborer's wage. So today that might be, 120, 150 bucks that a day laborer might get. Call it 100 to make the math easy. And you're talking, basically Philip's saying, this would be $20,000 to feed all these people, Jesus. And I love Andrew's response. Here's what I've got. I found this boy. He's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And that's sufficient for Jesus, isn't it? I think there's an important lesson we can learn from Andrew here, even as we're talking on Sundays about a servant's heart and bringing our part and doing our part. I think sometimes we worry that what we bring is not good enough. And I think Andrew was just bold enough to say, hey, I found some food. I don't think it's enough for everybody, but he at least brought it to Jesus. And then what did Jesus do with it? Multiplied it. Often when we bring our meager offerings, even though all common sense, can you imagine the other disciples when Andrew actually points out that he found 5 loaves and 2 fish? What do you think they were doing? They're probably scoffing at him and just like, well, what's that going to do? Thanks a lot, Andrew. That's great. Thanks for helping out. But Jesus takes it and it multiplies it. I think Andrew shows a lot of faith here. I don't think he knows what Jesus is going to do, but he just brings what he found. He's like, this is what we're able to do, Jesus. What can you do with it? And so I think he shows incredible faith here. Any other thoughts on Andrew's part in this miracle? No way. No way. Right? Does anybody else? I mean, I don't think, for those that might be watching online now or later, Val just asked you, do you think Andrew anticipated what Jesus was going to do with that food? I don't think so. Do we anticipate what Jesus is going to do, what we offer? No. We just leave it up to him, and I think that's what Andrew was doing at this point. This is what I got. Yeah, this is... Yeah. Yep. So Philip's worried about what it would take human-wise to feed all these people. $20,000 just for a lot of them to get a little bit, Jesus. Whereas Andrew says, okay, I don't know what God can do. Here's what we got. He's focused on what God can do, not what humankind can do. It's a neat example from Andrew for sure, one that we certainly need to learn from. It is, yeah. The widow giving her 2 mites. It's a lot like that. I've never compared those 2 stories, but yeah, absolutely. The widow's not worried about what 2 mites can purchase. She's worried about what God has instructed her to do and what God can do with her offering. Absolutely. So Andrew got to see the miraculous early on, be in on some private discussions as well. Let's look at Mark 13 for an interesting discussion, and this will be our last sample from Andrew specifically. And as he came out of the temple, Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when are these things going to be? And what will be the sign when all of these things are about to be accomplished?" Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray." Jesus goes on to tell them that there will be wars and rumors of wars, that there will be earthquakes. And he basically says there's going to be a lot of signs, but wait, I want you guys to do what you're told and just trust me. That was his basic instructions. And I think that's what the disciples lived out. And based on everything we've seen from Andrew, that's probably what he went and did. What do we learn from Andrew's life? Just a quick overview there. He had a deep faith, yes. Yeah. And sometimes those with I don't want to see if anybody else says. Anything else? He had a deep faith. What else do you see from Andrew's life? Put his faith into action. Yep. Very curious. Okay. Seemed to be the right place, right time. Okay. I think it's interesting. We don't really hear much about Andrew. Andrew is, we're getting now in the next one, Peter, James, John, Peter, James, John, Peter, James, John, and Judas. Those are the 4 you always hear of. But without Andrew, he brought Peter. Without Andrew, he brought the boy that had the loaves and the fish. And so Andrew was an incredible person of faith that did put that faith into action, that may not make the headlines, but a lot of people of just simple faith that just live with a God-honoring life, do do what they believe God is leading them to do, end up making an incredible difference, because that when the stone hits the water, it ripples, right? Andrew's life rippled. He might not have been that big of a rock, but he made an incredible impact for sure. I think he's a neat example. He really is. And he's one of the few we don't see many negatives from. You know, obviously the disciples have a lot, but Andrew's one that's never called out as one as a negative example. He's a very positive example of faith and following. Anything else that you pull from Andrew's life to help you on Thursday tomorrow? He was available. That's a good word too. I think that comes with faith, just to be available. We see that from his calling on. It's just, here I am, Lord, you know, whatever you need. Or here we go, Lord, we've got this little boy. Good. Anything else? Well, I've always been ending these with what legend says happened to them. We don't have this in the biblical text, but Andrew is said to have been martyred by crucifixion in Achaia. I think the story goes, I don't have the whole story here, that he basically led a governor or a local leader's wife to the Lord, and the leader said, "Oh, no, you don't," and had him crucified. Further legend says that he did not want to be crucified like his Lord, and so he wanted to be crucified not on the typical Latin cross, but on one that is an X. And so now that is commonly called a what? St. Andrew's cross. If you've ever heard of like Scotland's flag, that's called a St. Andrew's cross. Unfortunately, probably not the case. There's no evidence of that story until the Middle Ages. That it just says, the earlier text just says he was crucified. But typically, if you hear St. Andrew's cross, that's the Andrew they're talking about, because as legend goes, he wanted to be crucified differently than Christ. All right, any other comments on Andrew? And then we'll go on to James. All right, James. When it comes to doing a biographical study on James, you have to be very careful you're reading about the right James. If you ever want introduced to tools that are on the internet that you would love to be able to study these, we've even got some, if you're more comfortable with books, we've got some ways you can look some things up in the library. If you ever wanted to do a biographical study on a person, you start with just looking up where do they appear, pulling out those passages. And so that's what we're going to do with James. But like I said, there are several James, right? Multiple men are named James. We're going to focus in on the apostle. Interesting enough, too, I never get to talk about this because it seems like more of a Wednesday night thing. This is not something I would share on Sunday. But the name James, does anybody know what it is in the Greek? It's Jakobos. And so it's basically just a transliteration of the name Jacob. Have you ever wondered why we don't see anybody in the New Testament named Jacob? Well, we've got a lot of them. Everybody named James, their Hebrew name was Jacob. And so it's something we don't, again, talk about much, because there's James all over the place, and that makes sense that they were all given the Hebrew name Jacob. That gets Hellenized, what we would call it, into Greek as Jacobus, and then just follow it down through Latin and then through French, and for some reason in English it becomes James. There was always a legend that King James said, hey, put my name in there somewhere. But I don't know that that's true in the King James translation. But there are a lot of Jameses. But that would be the Hebrew name Jacob behind that. He has multiple mentions. The apostle himself, James, has multiple mentions, except for in one of the Gospels. Which Gospel doesn't mention James? No. Which Gospel? Which of the four Gospels doesn't mention James? Nope, it's John. John doesn't mention himself or his brother. If you remember, there's no appearance of the name James in John. He calls them at the end when they were in the upper room. What does he say instead of saying James and John? He says the sons of Zebedee. And that's the only mention of James or John throughout the book of John, except for John calling himself the disciple that Jesus loved. So multiple mentions, but you won't see any of them from John. So let's go first to his calling. Very similar to Andrew's, right there with Andrew's. In fact, it's just a continuation of the paragraph. So if you remember Andrew's calling, just tack on here in Matthew. And going on from there, he saw two brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Mark, similar account, follows right after the calling of Andrew. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in the boat mending their nets. And immediately he called them. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. So there's an added detail that we don't see in Andrew's calling here. What was it? We see the word immediately still. We see that they were fishermen. What different detail do you see? They were mending nets, yep. There was a father in the picture here. That made it, I don't know, but this makes it, I don't want to say it's more meaningful. It adds difficulty, it adds dedication for sure, but not only Simon and Andrew were walking away from their vocation, but James and John are walking away from their vocation, and their father's still on the boat. They're actually quitting that day's work and saying, I'm going to follow him. And so not only are they leaving their plans, they're probably leaving Dad's plans too. And so James, obviously from the get-go here, we see dedication. Let's look at Luke's account real quick. It's slightly different. In this case, and this could be another thing like John, maybe Luke is giving us the introduction to Jesus, whereas Matthew and Mark are giving us the call to go and follow him. So it could be the same thing here, and that could be the explanation. But we do learn something a little bit more about this circumstance. Jesus had got onto Simon Peter's boat and instructed him towards a miraculous catch of fish, if you remember that. Remember what Peter said, and we might even look at that in a couple weeks. Peter's like, dude, you're no fisherman. We've been fishing all night. We haven't caught anything. Jesus says, why don't you throw the nets on this side? Thinking, what? It's the same water. And then they haul in miraculously. They haul in this huge thing of fish. Verse 9, for he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. So also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. So, it seems like the same account, maybe just it happened a little bit differently than Matthew and Mark. Luke might go into just a little bit more detail. I like Luke's story better because it just gives us a little bit more detail. But I also like the aspect that you see James and John are leaving Zebedee as well. Anything on James's calling then so far? They're still in the area. They still have contact. What they were leaving was Dad's plans. They were leaving, hey, someday you guys are going to take over this business. I'm teaching you to mend these nets. I'm teaching you how to run this. And they left that. Yeah. So we talked about how Andrew, because he was an earlier disciple, got to be in on one or two things that other disciples didn't. But we get to Peter, James, and John, regularly considered the inner circle. James got to be witness to multiple miracles that the other disciples did not. Let's look at a couple of those. The first one is, if you remember, this one happened out in public. Jairus came to Jesus, requested, hey, my daughter's sick. Jesus starts heading that direction, and the woman with the issue of blood touches his garment. There's a crowd around. It delays, and then verse 35 of Mark chapter 5. Mark and Luke provide very similar accounts, so I'm just going to look at Mark's. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. In the middle of their grief, they actually mocked Jesus for saying that. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. Interestingly enough, always a good note, how long had the woman had the issue of blood? 12 years she had struggled with that. So there's some parallelism there. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. So there, Mark tells us exactly what James was feeling. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. An incredible miracle. We've read about this miracle before, but imagine being in the room. 5 people other than Jesus and the little girl in the room. Who were they? Mom, Dad, Peter, James, and John. I mean, I can't even imagine being included in this. And everybody else, just leave the room. All you other guys, leave the room. And then, I mean, I'd be trying to find a corner. I don't know what's going on, and then to watch this, I'd be in tears, wouldn't you? Just watching as he says, "Talitha kumi," and the girl gets up. Just absolutely just gives me chills. Yeah, Gary. Well, everybody else? I don't know. Lack of faith? What do you think? Is that just a hypothetical, or do you have a possible answer? Why did he have everybody else leave the room? I've always thought it was just lack of faith. I want mom and dad in here because mom and dad want this, and I want Peter, James, and John so they can see it. To laughter at him. So yeah, I'd ask him to leave too if I was. Yeah, you guys were mocking me. Why don't you get out of here? Yeah, that's true too. He wanted, and maybe that's why he said that the girl is just sleeping. And so he wanted just a select few at that point. And you guys have seen it early in Jesus' ministry. He regularly says, "Hey, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody." Whereas later on, he says what? Go and tell. Incredible miracle to be able to witness in the room for sure. Another one of those amazing moments that James got to be in on was the transfiguration. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have similar accounts, so I'm going to read Matthew's. Right before this, Jesus foretells his death, and he instructs the disciples that, hey, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. And then so 6 days after that, this happens. In 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell nobody the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." So transfiguration, an amazing event. Lots of scholarly speculation on what exactly is happening there. A lot of people put it up there with Jesus' baptism, maybe something to do with a preparation for his resurrection. There's all kinds of theories as to what exactly is happening here. But Moses and Elijah seem to speak to his everlasting nature. Regardless of what was going on, the girl getting up was one thing. James was able to sit there, and he met Moses and he met Elijah. And Peter obviously is the one that spoke up and said, "We got to stay here." James is just taking it all in and can't believe what he has witnessed to. Uh, Absolutely amazing. So we're going to talk about John next week, Peter the week after that. They kind of each get their own week because we got so much material in them. Hopefully 1 week is enough. But we do need to handle at least this question now so we don't have to do it for Peter and John. Why did Jesus allow this trio to experience more than the rest of the 12? That ever bugged you? Ever wondered that? I mean, I've just wondered. I don't think Jesus made a poor decision. I'm not saying that. But why? What is the purpose of him always pulling Peter, James, and John? We got one more instance a little later in the Garden of Gethsemane that James is in on. Something about their approach, yeah. They stuck out somehow. They had more faith in him than... That's hard to beat Andrew's faith, though. You see especially Peter's going to have his ups and downs. Yep. And that's what most scholars would come down on. All of these are theories. What you said, Sharon, what Gary said, all of them were there traits about these guys that made them stick out as leaders. But most folks would say if you look at who ends up taking over in the book of Acts, we're going to see James here in a minute, but Peter and John, something about these three, Jesus wanted to prepare them, and so that's why he wanted them to see more and experience more than the rest of the 12. Yeah, Ernie. Yeah, we do.
We look at our children, we look at people, and we see something in them.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, we single them out for certain things.
Yep.
And people may call it favoritism, whatever.
Yeah.
But we see that, and we know.
Yeah. And so you think that's what Jesus was doing, is basically he sees something in them. I mean, it's hard to pull leadership principles from Jesus because he's omniscient. And we're not. So he knows what's coming for them. Yeah. In fact, that's about to come. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you parlay that into what you're teaching us on Sunday morning, each one of those men were gifted in different ways.
That's true too. Yeah.
And these guys
Yep.
are definitely gifted in leadership, more
Yeah.
leadership roles. But I don't think it diminishes the gifting.
No. I mean, Thomas, Philip, Bartholomew, all those were still, yeah. James certainly wasn't without his issues, though. We've got a couple here to cover. Mark chapter 10:35. This is your favorite one. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "Okay, what do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in glory." Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "Yeah, we're able." Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. Now, you're familiar with this account. Matthew records it as who asking? The Mrs. Zebedee, let's call her. But here, Mark records it as James and John themselves making this request. An incredibly audacious request that shows what? Humanity. So a little bit of misunderstanding on what's coming, all these sorts of things, but what did you guys say probably Jesus called out in them? Leadership, right? I think you see a little bit of drive and ambition here. Is it good drive and ambition? No. But you do see a raw idea of ambition here. And so maybe this is just a little indication of what Jesus saw in them that needed refined. And so maybe that's a good lesson here for us, even as we're getting others in the game, as we're getting others involved. And sometimes you see raw qualities that just need some Jesus. And that's what you see here in James and John. Let's look at another one here, Luke chapter 9, verse 51. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So heading to Jerusalem for the last time, has to cut through Samaria. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and he rebuked them, and they went on to another village. I always found that one funny, too. You kind of get a little bit of the Sons of Thunder kind of feel there. Jesus, you know what we can do. You taught us we can bring down fire from heaven. These Samaritans need to pay for not receiving you. But what had Jesus already told them about villages that don't receive me? Do what? And so they were directly disobeying, weren't they? Jesus said, just move on. Don't worry about it. If people reject you, they reject you. Move on and go to the next one. And that's what Jesus lived out here. But instead, James and John wanted what? We'll show them who's boss. We'll show them. They didn't like Samaritans anyway, and I think they were already looking for an excuse, probably. One more instance of where James falls a little short here, but it's also that instance I referenced where he got to be in the inner circle. They went to a place, this is Mark 14, they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. They had to see that on him, right? That's not something Jesus acted like often. They had to see what was going on. Verse 34, he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and he found the three sleeping. He says to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you would not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again, he came back and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time, and he said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. A little bit of foreshadowing on another disciple there, huh? Peter, James, and John called out to be in the inner circle at Jesus' most distressed moment in his entire ministry. I've always thought it would be an interesting read on a Sunday morning, or like maybe a Good Friday service, to read Jesus' words, and then somebody from the back who goes, that's basically what was happening. Jesus is pouring out his heart, and Peter, James, and John have fallen asleep. Hard to judge him for that. I mean, the hour was late. They just had a nice Last Supper. Things were good. I mean, let's look at one more thing, and then I'll ask you what we can learn from James. So a couple of negatives there for James we see that he was in on. And then James' death is the only one of the 12 that we have recorded, except for Judas, of course. We have his death recorded in a couple places. In Acts chapter 12, we actually read of what happened to James the apostle. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. Peter ends up getting miraculously rescued. We'll talk about that probably later with Peter. But here, James just, in a sentence, is gone. Not a lot of story on what happened. He just laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. James was a leader of the church, just like Peter and John at that time. But then he was the first one to give his life of the apostles for the name of Christ. And so keep this in mind. After that, you begin to read of James being a leader in the church, right? That is not this James. Those are hard to keep straight sometimes in the book of Acts, because especially if you turn to Acts chapter 15, a person named James is incredibly prominent in the church of Jerusalem. That's James, the brother of Jesus. He takes over kind of as a leader, especially in the Jerusalem church. As Peter and John go and do their missionary stuff, James becomes James, the brother of Jesus. So we don't know a whole lot about James, the brother of John. We just know that he perished with a sword. He's the only apostle that we read for sure how he died. Everything else is church history and speculation. So what do we learn from James's life? Very similar lessons to the other disciples, right? Very bold, yeah. Wanted to bring fire down, wanted to... When was James the strongest? Wasn't when he tried to control things, right? It was when he just trusted Christ. I think that example of calling fire down on the Samaritans, I think some of us in the church fall into that sometimes too, that we want to smite the enemies of God to honor God. And Jesus kind of looks and says, I got this. We're just going to go on to the next town. Not that big a deal, James. Calm down. Anything else you'd learn from James that you can apply to your life? Mm-hmm. Turn our problems over to the Lord. That's good. Leave our plans behind. Leave our nets behind. Go with Christ. Know that we're going to mess up along the way, but be bold in the midst of it. And I do believe he saw something in James. We just didn't get to see as much as we got to see out of Peter and John in the book of Acts because his life ended too soon. But I do think he saw the same qualities there of boldness and ambition and drive. It just needs to be redeemed. Yeah, I could go further, but I won't. Any other thoughts on so what? It set the pace for his commitment. Yep. Yep.
Seems like regardless of what we think, whatever gifts we've been given, until we become humble and get outside
Yeah.
of ourselves, then God shows us truly who's in
Yep.
power.
Yep. We do a lot of, even in seminaries, I've done like personality studies and things like that, but every single personality needs redeemed. And I think you'd get this on the disc profile. You see probably a high D here that just needs redeemed. That ambition and drive and this is not a bad thing until you make it for selfish gain. Yeah, and try to control things. Okay, next week we're going to look at John. John's a little more humble, probably the younger brother of James. A little quieter, but wrote a lot, didn't he? And so we'll take a look at John all next week. The following week we'll take a look at Peter, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap it up with a couple more disciples. Let's pray. God, we continue to pray for just direction as we do this biographical study. It's not always as easy to apply, but it's kind of fun to do. As we look at these lives and we compare them to our lives, and I pray that we would learn from the ones that you chose to follow you closely, God, these apostles, these disciples. Continue to show us that they were just regular guys that just needed a little more Jesus in their life. There are so many qualities, so many gifts, so many abilities that you've given each one of us. And as Jesus redeems them, we can do amazing things. So I pray that you would continue to teach us that. Thank you for Andrew and his example of just a simple faith of bringing others to Christ. Not always being the one to step forward or showboat, just simply living in obedience to you. Bringing what he could offer and letting you do the rest. May we follow that example. God, may we have, if we're ambitious like James, may we be redeemed in that ambition and that drive. Continue to allow us to trust you and let you be in control of our lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name, and amen. Have a blessed rest of your week. See you on Sunday.